Hello, I've got another painting for you here, and what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is share two parables that Jesus told that are recorded in the Gospel of Luke, and then hopefully make some application of the lessons from those parables that would apply the Gospel of Jesus Christ to current events. And so I'm going to start out in Luke chapter 10, verse 25 through 37. I'm going to read this to you. I've got parts of it illustrated on the painting. I'll show you that after I've read it. Luke 10:25. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested Jesus, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. He said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you. So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? He said, He who showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. So I just want to illustrate and discuss just a little bit this interaction that Jesus had with this man, and this parable that he told him. Parable being a story to illustrate a point. And they were starting from a point of the idea of that we are to love God and that we are to love our neighbors. And so this man asked a question of Jesus following up on that. And it says there, if you remember what I read, it says that he wanted to justify himself. So he was looking at, okay, I know I'm supposed to love my neighbor, and whether I'm doing a good job of that or not is going to depend a lot on who I consider to be my neighbor. Because there were people that he loved, and there were people that he didn't love. And so the question that he asked, I'm just going to start with that. The question he asked is, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus, to illustrate who his neighbor was, he tells him this story. Okay, and he tells of a man that was going down the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, and it says that he was beaten and left on the side of the road in his own blood there to die by thieves. And these thieves had come and they had taken everything that he had, down to his clothes. And so this is a picture here of the thieves, and we don't know how many there were. It was plural. I just drew 2 because that was the easiest way I could make it plural. So here's the 2 thieves, and they're on their way. They're getting out of here. They've got all of his stuff. They've probably got some of his blood on their hands and on their garments from what they did to him. And they're leaving the scene. And here's this man suffering, probably going to die without help. And Jesus tells a story of a man comes by and he sees what's going on here. And what he does is he crosses to the other side of the road and goes on by as if he'd never seen. And then a second man comes along and does the same thing. So this guy's now off here in the distance, going on his way. Second man comes, also passes by, and they both pass by this man, leaving him there wounded, naked, with nothing to his name, and going on their way to whatever it is that they had to do. And then he talks about a third man that comes along. But there's something important here that we need to get to understand the context, and that is when he describes who these people were. The first 2 men were a priest and a Levite. What that's saying is they are of the same group as this guy that was wounded on the side of the road. They are the same group as the man Jesus is talking to. Okay? And they passed on by this person who was their, in some sense, relative, their countryman. He was of their religion. He was of their culture. And they walked on by. But then the third man that comes along that cares for him, he says he was a Samaritan. And if we know the history between the Jews, which is the people that are all involved over in this scene, including Jesus and the person he was talking to, and the Samaritans, there was not a good relationship. In fact, the Jews despised, hated the Samaritans. They would go, if they needed to get to someplace on the other side of Samaria, the place where the Samaritans lived, they would go around. And you think, well, that's not a big deal. Remember, most of them were walking. Okay? They would walk a day's journey out of their way just to avoid passing through where these people lived. That's how hated they were. That's how bad the relationship was between these two groups of people. And so when Jesus in his story brings in the Samaritan as the man who comes and does good, that would have been extremely insulting to the person he was talking to. It would have been very hard for him to take. But that's what he did. And so he has the Samaritan man coming, and he puts this man on his own animal, which means that now that this man, who apparently had enough money to have his own animal and not be walking, is now walking while the nearly dead man is on his animal. And so he's probably leading the animal. And he's going to, takes him to an inn, and at his own expense, he cares for him. Okay, he doesn't ask the man at the inn to do it. He does it all out of his own. And he takes care of him. And so then we get to the end of the story, and Jesus asks the question. Remember, the guy started out with the question, who is my neighbor? Jesus turned that question upside down. And instead of saying, who is your neighbor, he was talking about, how can you be a good neighbor? And it doesn't matter who the other guy is. Okay? And so, and the man answered correctly. But it's interesting that even in answering the question, Jesus gave him three choices. It was A, B, or C, right? It was, we've got a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And he says, which of the three was a neighbor to this man? Now, if I was answering the question, which of the three, I would either say the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan. This man wouldn't even bring himself to say out loud that the Samaritan was the one who had done what was right. But he did answer correctly nonetheless. He said, the one who showed mercy. Okay? And so that's the first of the two parables that I want to look at. The second one is found later in the book of Luke, chapter 18, starting in verse 9. So let me read that one, and then I'm going to go back through and kind of explain what I want you to see out of this. It says, also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. He said, two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's the story. And so I just illustrated this one a little bit. We've got this man. He's a Pharisee. And he was in the temple. So in the temple was where they would go to meet with God. And there were things that would keep people separated from God, so that people couldn't actually go into what was considered to be the presence of God. And so there was a curtain that kept them out. Okay? And depending on how righteous, how clean a person was, whether they were of the right family, would determine how close to that place where God dwelt they could get. And so you have this first man who goes up close and says to God, look at me. Look at how good I am. I'm not like this other guy back here. And you've got the other man back here, the tax collector, and it says that he was back there and he would not so much as look up, and that he beat his breast and he said, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, again, understanding the context, who Jesus was talking to, same kind of people he was talking to up here, they would have identified with this man. They would have looked down on this man. And so Jesus did something that, again, he just totally flipped their understanding upside down. They'd be looking at it and saying, okay, we're with you so far in the story. We've got our good guy and our bad guy. Now, what's he going to teach us from that? And here's what he taught them from that. He pointed to this one over here, the tax collector. And he says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Or in other words, this man went down, God pleased with him. He was right with God. And here's how he explains it. He says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. I want to look at these two parables, like I said, and bring out, I'm going to go 5 points that we hopefully can take these and apply them to our own lives and to current events. And so I want to look a little more into this idea here before I get to those points of there was this curtain that separated them from God. All right? There was a reason the curtain separated from God, and that was because this guy who was looked up to, who was the best man in the community probably, and this man who was looked down upon, he was a thief, a traitor. They both had the same problem, and that was that their sin had separated them from God. And this curtain represented that separation that was brought about by their sin. And so it brings us to why Jesus came. You know, in both of these settings that I just shared from, Jesus was acting as a teacher, and he was a teacher, but he was so much more than a teacher. The reason he came, he never said the reason I came was to teach. Okay? He did do that. It was part of it. But the reason he came was to give his life, and to serve others. And so we're going to look at this. It's that most people know that Jesus died on a cross. A lot of people also know that when Jesus died on a cross, there was not a single cross, but there were 3. There were 2 criminals that died, one on either side. Men like these ones up here. And a couple things that I want us to pull out of that. One is when we look at this story and we look at these criminals, and it's like, I hope they didn't get away with what they did. They never or do. But in this case, we had 2 criminals similar to the group of criminals that we had up there, and they'd been caught and they were being punished. But you see, God sees whether they ever get justice under man's law. So we got Jesus and these 2 thieves. And an interesting thing happened when Jesus died on the cross. So the reason the 2 thieves died is they were thieves. They were criminals. They were suffering consequence for their crime. In fact, they were undoubtedly more than simply thieves, because just stealing did not warrant a death penalty. But there were other things, most likely murder along with theft. But they were suffering for their crime. Jesus was not. So Jesus had never sinned. He'd never done anything wrong. And so when he died, it was different than when they died. When they died, justice was done. We could argue it was maybe overdone, probably was, but it was, in some sense, justice being done. When Jesus died, there was no justice for Jesus in his death, because Jesus was completely innocent. But see, while they died for their crimes, Jesus died for yours and for mine. And an interesting thing happened, and it's just a line in the account of what happened that you could easily overlook in reading through. But what it says is that when Jesus died, that curtain that separated people from God was torn in 2. So man was on one side of the curtain, God was on the other side of the curtain. And when Jesus died on the cross, he took away that separation. And the way he could do that is because our sin separated us from God. Jesus took our sin on himself. He took the punishment for it, and he made a way for us to be connected to God. And he suffered, and he suffered in order for us to be able to receive something in return. And I've decided to just put it here as a single word. But when he suffered and died, mercy came to the sinners. Okay? That is the story of Jesus, and very briefly. There's obviously much more. And these 2 parables that he told. What I want to do now is to take that and apply it to things that are going on in our world today that you probably have noticed. Okay? And the first thing is this. we look at these two guys right here, and I want to ask you to think about which one you identify with. And I would think if we're honest, all of us, we have a definite tendency in this direction, but sometimes we're like this, okay? But I want to look at it specifically. There's been a lot of discussion around race in America going on. There's been a lot of events, a lot of horrible things going on, and a lot of good things going on if you pay attention. And what I hear from a lot of people, and I've heard it many times from myself, is I didn't do anything. It wasn't me, okay? And that can be completely true, okay? I haven't oppressed anyone. I haven't hated anyone. I certainly haven't killed anyone. Haven't destroyed somebody's business or home or life. I didn't do anything. And yet I've got people that are wanting me to somehow respond to this. And honestly, sometimes I think, why should I? But there's something that I realized a while back, and I think that this parable illustrates it really well. And that is this. This is my first point. And if this bothers you, please hang with me. There are 5, and the first one's probably the one most likely to bother you. But I want you to think this through, okay? And my first point is this, is that sentence, I didn't do anything, is not a declaration of innocence. It is a declaration of guilt, okay? Saying, I didn't do anything is not a declaration of innocence. It is a declaration of my guilt. Think of it in terms of this parable that Jesus told. How many characters really were there in the parable? There were actually only 3. I mean, in essence, if you go through and read back over it, okay, Luke chapter 10, read back over it, there are only 3 people. At the end, he asks the man, which of the 3 people, and the guy knew what he was talking about, okay? This man, the victim, and the group of criminals were simply part of the scene. For Jesus to tell a story about 3 men, okay? And in this story, he was separating who was doing what was right from who was doing what was wrong. There was one man who did what was right. And the example that Jesus used to illustrate what was wrong was not the murdering thieves. It was the guys who did nothing. Okay? In this story, I have way too often in my life been these guys. Okay? So when I say I didn't do anything, this is what I'm saying. I was on the other side of the street when it happened. Okay? Let that sink in. Point number 2. We need to humble ourselves. You do, I do. We need to be like this man here. We need to humble ourselves. We need to recognize our condition. Okay? Our natural thing to do, because we are naturally prideful, is like this man here, is to compare ourselves to someone else and say, hey, I'm looking pretty good. Okay? You say, hey, look at me. I would not have done what that officer in Minneapolis did. Look at me. I'm not rioting and looting. I'm very upset about things, but I'm not breaking the law because of it. Or look at me. I'm not inconveniencing people by holding up traffic. Humble ourselves. And simply say, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that brings me to my third point, and that is to go to God for mercy. We need the mercy of God. We need to humble ourselves and come to God and plead for his mercy. And when we do, because of what Jesus did, when Jesus shed his blood on the cross, he made a way for us to have access to God, to have the mercy of God poured out on us in ways that we can't even imagine. So number 3 is to go to God for mercy. And the way we do that is by acknowledging that there's something wrong and then humbling ourselves. My 4th point is this, is to look for examples of mercy. Look for examples. They aren't hard to find, but they're not easy either. They're not hard to find because they're everywhere. Because there are people who, whether they know it or not, are created in the image of God. And because we're created in the image of God, we have this in us, this desire to do acts of mercy. But they can be hard to find because most of our media, both the professional media and the social media, tends to focus on this part of the picture right here and miss this. And so I just want to encourage you to look for them. Okay? And that might mean changing your media habits in order to do that. But when we focus here, what that does, it really does two things to us. One is it can lead to despair, and the other is it can lead us right here. It can lead to pride when we look down on the people who are doing what is wrong. We don't ignore these things, but we need to focus in on those who are doing acts of mercy. And then my final point is this. It was the last thing that Jesus said in this parable to the man that had correctly answered his question about who the neighbor was. He said, go and do likewise. Recognize I didn't do anything is not an excuse. It's actually a declaration of guilt. Humble yourself. Come to God for mercy. Experience the mercy of God through Jesus Christ. Look for examples of mercy around you. And then after you've experienced the mercy of God and seen that acted out by other people, go and do likewise.